Welcome back. I'm Greg Lowen, and I'm delighted to continue to read and share with you my Arc of Folktales Raven Today from 2017. We just saw in Chapter 4 how Raven had to contend and confront a very dangerous being, a shadow being from the past of his children, and a shadow being whose shadow overcast even the present. Now Raven turns to the great city of the newcomers in Chapter 5, Raven and the City. A cacophony of cloistered costs. To Raven's ears, this was the great city of the newcomers. To his eyes, an undulating ocean of gray, punctuated here and there by giant pillars of lighter or darker gray. From far above, little could be seen of the people who inhabited, but there must be many of them, so many that Raven rapidly lost track of any sense of personhood. He had read that the city was like a great house, in which all were welcome. Perhaps the giant pillars in which people seemed to actually live were like welcome poles, but these pillars were everywhere, though they seemed centered in on one or two specific zones of the metropolis. And was everyone really welcome here? Raven had also discovered through his cousin, Crow, that the relatives of his children congregated in places like this one far to the east. Some of these cities were even larger than the one Raven beheld sprawling below him. This alone was extraordinary, but all across the world, Raven now reckoned, it had been the same story. More than this, Crow had informed him that once within the boundaries of the city, the relatives of his people could expect to live no more than 35 cycles, especially the men. This made Raven shudder, for he had read that in some other world, far, far from the land he knew and loved, there was a place called Botswana, where the life expectancy was actually one cycle longer than this. Still utterly horrifying, numbers that were less than those of the time of his people, before the newcomers ever showed up. Though Crow and Raven didn't get along all that well, Raven found his smaller cousin to be sometimes a font of interesting information. Crow went everywhere, saw everything. He had been to all of the newcomers' giant villages across the entirety of the land, of which apparently Raven's region was only the most extreme western portion. This in itself was quite interesting and suggested that if Raven himself flew eastward, he would encounter a great country that lay beyond the imposing mountain ranges that divided this western land. But Raven felt no compulsion to do so. After all, these were other peoples that lived there, and they would not know him. Crow had also warned him that his own children, broken, destitute, and inebriated, those few who had come to the center of the newcomer's city down below and lost themselves therein, would have forgotten him too. This was the real reason Raven was now where he was, for he generally avoided the giant city. There was little to eat, and even the ever-resourceful Crow had to work hard to make a living there. There was much competition in this realm as well, for gull was also ubiquitous in the seaside city, and other animals that Raven never encountered in the forest, like rat, or even those that could be seen, like raccoon, who seemed astonishingly more comfortable in the environs of the newcomers' places than they had ever done before these strange and ostentatious peoples arrived. For everything the newcomers did had to be done big. Some of the giant pillars wherein people lived and worked stretched higher into the sky than Raven generally flew himself. Only Eagle then might find a perch right at the very top of them. But the top of these tall structures was not useful for Raven's current quest in any case, for he could not see much of anything from such a height. Raven's vision was best when he was close at hand. His friend Eagle was the one to ask about faraway sights. So Raven dove right into the thick of things, closing his ears to the noise of the place. Once alighting on the gray and black surfaces of the pathways in the midst of the structures, Raven knew he sought not the heights of this enamored and altogether brash venture, but rather the depths. For it was into these that some few of his children had fallen, or been forced to fall, and no creative spirit was worth its salt, unless it gathered together all of those who were its children under its care and concernfulness. But the challenge here was not only to find these lost souls, but to somehow communicate with them and bring them out of the depths. It was as if the city was some extended version of the stranding ritual, but one from which those marooned never returned. This was because they had stranded themselves, or been stranded by the newcomers and not their own people, and thus the people didn't even know to check in on them, and later rescue and welcome them back to their home villages, as was done in the past. But unlike the remote islands of the north coast, upon which the odd youth was straddled for a cycle to regain his or her sense of community, wild woman and wild man were never to be seen in the city. It would scare them out of their wits, Raven surmised, thereby reversing the time-honored role of the Bukwus and Zenokwa. They were the ones that scared the youths back into their community, and now they themselves were too scared to perform this role. Raven had a hunch that this was the effect of this noisome place. Everything in it was inverted. Instead of living on the ground, its people lived in the air. Instead of letting in sun, they had made their own light. Instead of speaking to one another, they simply walked or otherwise hustled right on by, ignoring their fellows. Instead of giving, they engaged in taking from one another. Instead of encountering the wild ones and thereby comprehending their actual place and value to their respective communities, they made themselves wild and never quite returned to their places of origin. Well, who would have them back? Raven was now forced to ponder such questions that he had never before had to think about, and yet it seemed like everyone desired to live here, in the middle of all things, and with all senses on the highest alert. The city sucked them right in, as it did the resources from its hinterland, the trees and waters, the rocks and metals. Even the air itself was breathed in by a pair of oversized lungs and then expelled, colored with slight tinges of yellow and brown. Indeed, Raven was finding it more and more difficult to breathe when he departed from the areas right near the shoreline. From afar, the city generally had the countenance of a dingy, shop-worn business frontage. One had to fly quite far away from it to even get fresh air back again. Apparently, it was the fault of the giant land canoes and the places to which they delivered things. Once again, it had been Crow who had supplied this interesting, though not quite salient, information about the condition of the newcomers' pride and joy. On the other hand, Raven had to admit that the city was impressive. To build all this out of what must have seemed like nothing to them when they arrived was a marvel of vision and confidence. To see the tallest trees and say to oneself, I will build something of my own even taller, or to gaze in awe at the even taller mountains that circled to the northwards and began to punctuate the eastern flatlands off on the horizon just there, and to say to oneself, I will bring the mountains to me and make out of them my own mountains. Well, this required, too, a great spirit, acquisitive, arrogant, adaptive, and possessed of a self-certainty that overcame even the almost equally strong self-doubt Raven had sensed in the newcomers' souls. For in the end, this was not their land, and yet in spite of this, they had made it so. The only thing similarly astonishing would have been when his own children first came to the land, which was then entirely empty of people. Then, too, it was not their land, and yet his children, with his help, of course, had made it so. But then they had lost it. The process of regaining what had been theirs had been lengthy and arduous, and it was still quite incomplete. But one of the steps must be to rescue the lost souls of the newcomers' cities, and Raven recognized, and had recognized long ago, that now his land would have to be shared. The newcomers, for the most of the interim, had not recognized this, but were slowly coming round to it, even as Raven searched the pathways and buildings below him for signs of his children. Well then, the first people had begun to share the land with the animals and transformer beings who were already there, including himself. There had been so few of these once new people that his comrades had shrugged when he had explained to them how he had rescued them from the giant clamshell in which they had floated across the great ocean and were cast ashore. They were no threat, and never had been. But things were different now, so much so that even Kanakalik kept his distance. He had told Raven that these new people were like the Transformers, since they were able to reshape the landscape to their liking and erect massive structures, the kind of which only he had ever been able to effect before. Kanakalik had felt the heat of competition for the first time and had retreated into an unquiet retirement. But Raven had just seen how the Transformer was still aware of the evils in the world, as well as the great feats, and was still able to freeze them for posterity in the same manner he had always done. The posterity of the newcomers was, however, yet more grandiose even than Kanakalik's own. It was as if they feared their own death so much that the city was one cosmic memorial to itself. With this in mind, Raven was acutely aware that one could not live in a mortuary. Those of his children who had found themselves ensconced within it had to be brought back out. They were like the souls who had ventured, through illness, into the dark tunnel that separated the land of people from the land of the spirits. Cayuman would wait at one end of it and snarl at them if it was not their time. The souls would be frightened and return to their proper place inside the bodies of the still living and yet to live. On other occasions, the village shaman would have to himself or herself give chase, excerpting their own spirit from their body to do so. A risky venture either way. Raven knew the Guardian found it tiresome to have souls that weren't actually ready to pass over clog up the path to the spirit world, and it made her angry. The people had gradually learned of this and were generally healthy. But these days, Raven realized, some of his children had found a way to both avoid the snarls of the Guardian and avoid living in the land of the people as well. They had come to the newcomer's city and discovered this dark third way. It was what the newcomers called addiction that allowed his children to avoid both living and dying all at once. This was certainly a magic of some evil genius, Raven admitted, but he knew that even if the people had discovered an odd third way of being human, that it wasn't right. One was either alive or one wasn't, and there was no in-between, no middle ground between worlds. No, his children had discovered through their own in-betweenness a liminality of loss, a litany of lament. Above all reasons, it was this that Raven had to overcome. And with this thought he lit upon one such person, laying in a shadow-shrouded narrowness that others seemed to avoid. Though it was broad daylight, sun had overlooked this strip, and the structures of the newcomers had kept it in perpetual shade. Indeed, now that his eyes were adjusting to the urban gloom, Raven could see a number of his people lying about. Once again, all had been inverted, and people slept during the day and roamed the place at night as if they were wolves. Then Raven realized he had hit upon the help he needed. Wolf! Reliable, wily, resourceful, and loyal, Wolf would be the perfect helpmate for these lost souls, shepherding them out of the city and back into their own land, their own homes. And to top it all off, Wolf was as gray as was the city itself. No one would see her at her work. She could steal in and out with the souls of the children, and no one could stop her. Raven took a moment to congratulate himself on his mostly unerring acumen, and then got to work. But in croaking out his usual greetings for the people to hear, he found that they did not respond. He tried various tongues, those from up and down the coast that he had learned soon after his own children had spread out and populated his land. Indeed, he had read that comrades of those who had been digging with the spirit of the fierce people's artist had discovered an ancient place to the north along the central coast, a place they called Heltsuk. It was the oldest such place known, they claimed. Raven knew of older places, of course, but it was not lost on him that they were almost all underwater, sometimes many hundreds of feet. This was due to the melting of the ice long ago. The people had actually gotten it wrong in their stories, for they thought that Heltsuk was a refuge from the ice, whereas in fact it had been merely the place closest to where the ice was, high above the great villages that had lain on the wide strip of land covered over by the great flood after the ice melted. Then the rising waters had simply forced his people inland, where they then had lived until the present day, or at least until the newcomers started showing up. So now the place they called Heltsuk looked like it was on the outer edge of things instead of the inner, as it was originally. Like the city, the ice inverted everything, Raven mused. So Raven had another coruscation. He tried speaking in reverse. It was quite a trick, and Raven was proud he had thought of it, but the people no more understood what he was trying to tell them than when he had simply spoken normally. It was getting frustrating. Since it seemed no use at all to try to communicate with the fallen children as they were, Raven decided to adopt a more radical sensibility. He would speak to the souls of the people using the same method that the shamans used to use, and indeed had borrowed from himself. He had no rattle and no smoke, but Raven placed himself in a dark alcove that smelled of urine and vomit and prodded himself into a deep sleep. In the dream time of Raven, he didn't have to travel far before he encountered a group of spirits huddling in a doorway. They were divorced from their inebriated bodies and were wretchedly clinging to one another. Though their eyes were cast down into themselves, his croaky greeting was instantly recognized, and the people began to weep at the very sight of him. "My children, oh, my poor children!" Raven exclaimed with compassion. "You must follow me out of this evil place. I have traveled here to find you and you alone, and yet, as you are together here, you remain alone and apart from all community. Please let me return you to your own place, the place where you belong, to breathe the air and drink of the water untainted by the addict of the cityscape." To this exhortation the astonished people replied, "Raven, great spirit of the coast, we never thought to see you again. But it is you who must rid yourself of this place and all in it, for the evil will suck you in as well." It was moving for Raven to note that the souls of the lost people had immediately thought of him and not of their own fates, but he was also puzzled. He was certain he himself would not be taken in by the distorted dream of the city, but did these people know something he didn't know? "I do not understand this. We will leave together, you and I. It is simply a matter of regaining your own self. I will help you." "Such a thing is not to be regained," bemoaned the people in return. "This is what we have come to. There is no one who would welcome us back. Raven, you must understand that the antidote we have taken works against both the absence of community and community itself. It forbids both to us at once, for in taking this substance into our bodies, we have created a false community. Thus you behold us as we really are." This was a stunning insight, and Raven was taken flat aback by it. The very people who had lost themselves knew the reason for it, and yet they were helpless against its force. Indeed, Raven just then realized that this condition of his street children was an echo, an extension, and a mimicry of the conquest. It had the form of a disease on top of everything else. It was no mere metaphor then, but a real force that continued to arrest and vanquish his people, as well as many others, just had done the original illnesses of the time of the Great Death. This was a revelation. Then this place, the giant village of the newcomers, has within it as many lost souls as were originally lost to us? Perhaps not quite as many, wise one, but even so it recapitulates all that sought to destroy us, from the false community of substance to the cures shilled by the newcomers. They sell these things to us and to themselves as well. Raven now recollected that the shadow being had spoken of the evil of evil. Now Raven was beginning to understand what it had meant. The evil of evil was like a kind of fakery, a fraud that pretended to be everything at once. Fraudulence in the work of totalization might be a good way to describe it then. Its viscous, oily skein had enveloped his children and many others besides, up and down the coast, urban and rural, young and old, men and women and all others in between. It knew no bounds, as it always aspired to everything at once. But its very aspiration was based on a fraud. It covered over everything, yes, subverted it, corrupted it, but it was never actually it, itself. Like the city, the evil of evil gave off the impression that it could be something for everyone, that all could find a home within it. The city was itself a drug. I will fly away for help, my children, but I will return. You must keep your faith in me, and more importantly, in yourselves. I will return unto you. Raven intoned solemnly, pledging his life in doing so. The huddled spirits of his people could only nod in reply. They shuddered and shook like the earth when it so moved, and indeed the earth had moved for these people, opening up a chasm into which they had fallen. Its walls were precipices, its caverns the aborted aim of those who would have lived, would have chosen to live. They were cradled by the dark angels of an icy chalice, and their bedside was minded by the minions of rodents. Raven awoke, shaking and shuddering himself. He had breathed for too long the miasmatic atmosphere of this narrow in-betweenness, and knew he needed to get out. The people were right about one thing, he thought grimly. This place will overcome you if you stayed for too long and didn't realize what one was about. Flying eastwards now, Raven sought Wolf. During this time of the cycle, Wolf foraged during the night and slept in a deep cave during the day. But which cave? Caves were the primordial response to the night. Ironic, because they could be even darker than night, simply because no starlight reached into their crannies. But Raven knew there were times when one had to fight fire with fire, light with light, and darkness with the dark itself. If the evil of evil was the pretense at Godhead, at the all and the everything, then Raven knew that it would fall, if what it pretended to be was shown as not the one, but the many, in fact, as it actually was. The proof of this was right in front of him. He was searching for his comrade Wolf precisely because he could not take on this momentous task by himself, and indeed Wolf would be better suited at it than even he. But where would she be? For caves also sheltered a number of his other friends and familiars, Bear, for one, and even the Guardian herself. Lightning Snake, when he wasn't gallivanting about, slept in a cave somewhere or other, and many less ostentatious creatures and beings besides. Not all of them could rusticate together, for not all of them got along all that well and had different needs and skill sets, but even so. And then there was the Cave of Caves, far to the north, where one of the first men had by chance happened upon the transformer beings in their dance of dances. Raven was momentarily startled at such an ancient memory, one of the very first things he could recall in this new time out of time. Indeed, anything from the period of transformation had become a little murky for him of late. But it was of the essence that transformation be effected once again, and as soon as possible. The substance of this new plague had transformed his children into shadows, and once again Raven could find a minute or two to actually thank the dangerous shadow being he had recently encountered and turned to good use. It was evidence that even in the depths of misery and villainy there was wisdom and wit yet. Raven knew he might well have to presume upon his children's native wit to extricate them from this tight place. Hence Wolf. Over the ages, Wolf had often found herself in such tight spots, and had always been able to wrangle a way out of them. She wasn't so much fierce as determined, dogged. No poet, to be sure, as was Eagle or Spirit Bear, but the doggerel Wolf had written in tribute to her own history had a keen sense of taste to it nevertheless. It was a subculture that underpinned the higher culture, and indeed Wolf would recite her lines to the lost children, allowing them to see that they could still carve a place out of the community they had wandered away from. The urban wild people had defrauded themselves by mimicking Bookwis and Sonuqua and scaring themselves into submission in doing so, but Wolf had never thought so much of her own self that she had become delusory. She knew she was just what she was and nothing more. Unlike the spirits of the air, and even more so, those with the extended powers of uncanny force, the spirits of the ground were, well, grounded. Raven could not think of a better way to describe their character. Bear, deer, squirrel, and wolf herself, utterly reliable, even if their cleverness was lesser than others, including Raven himself. But it was something to say in return that what the lost souls needed was not so much cleverness and poetic wit, not the legendary and the awesome, but the very much down-to-earth pith and pugnaciousness of Wolf and her like comrades. This was not a job for Eagle, for instance, let alone Kanakallak, and just here Raven knew that a virtue on his side would be his sense of humility and generosity, for Wolf might well question why he, Raven, had come to him, Wolf, and not taken on the thing directly. Now well out from the last vestiges of the great city, Raven began to explore the local caverns. The first few series yielded little, but there had been some signs of recent activity, footprints for instance. People no longer lived in caves, and Raven couldn't recall a time when they had done so, at least in his land. And these were not the feet of the Sasquatch, they were much smaller and had crisscross patterns on them. That could only mean a regular person who covered his or her feet up with protective material. Another clever, if simple idea. This thought recalled Raven to his own, as yet unhealed foot. The talon had begun to grow back, but it was still quite tender, and he didn't relish the idea of hopping around on one side. Flying in and out, nodding to Bat, who came to greet him with some surprise at his appearance, he asked if she had seen anyone of late. "Yes, Raven, my giant but distant cousin, I have seen one of your children through here, and in many other places like this as well." Raven acknowledged her with a croak of surprise himself, and asked in which direction this unexpected person had gone. She went ever eastward, it appeared, to the places where the newcomers drilled their strange galleries. Aha, this was interesting. There were caves, and then there were caves. Raven had heard that in the early days of the newcomers, they had actually bore right through mountains in order to send their land canoes of the time straight onto the coastal waterways. But they had long been disused, and were now treated by the animal beings and others the same way as the ancient caverns were treated. And now it seemed that one of his own had an interest in both after all these generations. Why would this be so? Raven knew again that he would become distracted by this novel information, but as it was, he was going to visit these places anyways. Might as well follow up on it while he was at it. Inwards up the great pathway the newcomers had also built through the mountains and into the first set of canyons beyond the flatlands. He espied a land canoe stopped by the mouth of one of the deep tunnels. He flew by it and into its shadows, his beady eyes adjusted. He then saw a bright light, reminding him of the light that shone at the distant end of the mysterious tunnel that led to the world of the spirits. Some had claimed that it was the teeth of the guardian that shone of themselves, but Raven knew that it was rather the effect of her glowing eyes. But Cayuman was not in here. This was not the spirit tunnel at all, but one that the newcomers had sculpted artfully and cleverly. Kanakallak himself might have been impressed with it, as it looped round and in circles, funneling the giant pensive mass of the old-style land canoe through it, and down the western slope of this or that mountain. A crazy idea, Raven thought, but it had evidently worked for a time, until other passages had been devised that were simpler and took less time to construct. Following the light now, he came upon who must have been the same woman Bat had encountered. He tried not to startle her, and announced himself from the middle distance with his greeting he reserved for his own children. The woman yelped even so, and dropped her lamp, which, though it made a great deal of clamor in its fall, remained alit. "Good Lord, it is Raven! How about that?" the woman exclaimed. "What on earth are you doing in a cave, brash bird? And especially one like this, where you could easily lose yourself?" The woman's words were telling in an odd way. Raven mused. Getting lost had been the point of the souls attracted to the city, and the cave was the very opposite of the city, where in the previous age the youth of his people would come to seek visions and commune with animal spirits. Dangerous, but also boldly wise. That must be what this woman was doing then, recapitulating something from her ancient heritage. She must have heard about it from one of the odd elders who still existed in some communities. They knew many of the stories, but not all of them. The vision quest would supply a story no one had yet heard, unless of course the spirit being itself had forgotten them. This was a disturbing thought, and Raven quickly dismissed it from his mind to focus on this encounter, which couldn't be put down to mere chance. "Brave and intrepid woman, daughter of whale and hummingbird alike, I believe you might well be my good fortune and my grace today, for I search for Wolf. Have you by chance seen or heard of her?" Oh. The woman was just staring at him as he croaked on. No, this wouldn't do at all. She was clearly not on a vision quest after all, at least not of the sort Raven was used to. Her waking self had no clue what he was saying to her. He would have to speak with her spirit then, which meant putting the woman to sleep at the very least. How to do that? An old trick came to mind. I will breathe in all the air in the cave and hold it long enough for the woman to lose consciousness. Then, after she is slumbering, I will expel it again, and her body will breathe normally. Before she awakes, I will ask her my questions. Raven then did so, and the woman collapsed, first to her knees and then right down on her side. The first thing Raven did when he beheld the woman's spirit looking imploringly at him was to reassure her of his intents and the outcome of which he desired from them. My apologies, Braveheart. I must speak with you, and as your quest is new to me, you were not hearing my language consciously. I had no idea you came in to find me, the woman exclaimed in astonishment. Why ever would that be, Raven? I seek Wolf, and know not where she is rusticating at the moment. I would ask her to come back to the city with me and shepherd the lost souls of the streets back to their communities. But you, though you are clearly not lost, have nevertheless come back to the origins of all homes. Why is that? I am on a quest, clever one, just one that is different from those before. I seek the knowledge of the living things that inhabit these caverns, fungi, moss, and mushrooms. In their spirit is the cure for illnesses of all kinds, treatments for the sick and for the dying. Aha, this was extraordinary, and Raven immediately recognized that this woman, and presumably others, were already doing the very thing that he and his comrades had thought must be done, or at least part of it. The microscopic and yet dread transformer being that had killed most of his people in the Great Death was the prey of this woman, or rather, the prey of what she hoped to find inside the caves. How brilliant, Raven thought. My people have always used such cures, but they did not work on the plague. You seek a new cure, then? Yes, my old friend. I seek it, and I seek it with the know-how of the newcomers themselves. They too couldn't save their own when the plague hit, as it was indiscriminate in principle. So they started a new science, one that we ourselves knew as medicinally valid. But their tools see things so small, things that we could not see at all. Things like the plague itself, Raven realized. But you are Squamish, is that not right? That is what your people call themselves? Yet you know the newcomers' knowledge and have their skills, and you have even grasped their idea of the future. You must be the present-day shaman. At this, the woman's spirit laughed. No, my venerable ally, it is simply something that anyone can learn. Culture is portable, old friend, and as we can learn that of the newcomers, so they could learn ours if they cared to. Raven had yet to see much of that occur. But there was nothing that prevented it, again, in principle. Just as the plague didn't respect peoples and their beliefs, the very beliefs of any people could travel, as did he himself. For a long time it had been forced, and yet now this woman, his own daughter, had turned around and partaken willingly of the newcomer's beliefs, and turned them also to her advantage. Astonishing, and yet the very answer to the puzzle Raven had been confronted with. Here was the model for all of those souls lost in the entanglement of deadly device. Raven was overjoyed now that he had met her, and of course it couldn't have been by chance. You must be Hummingbird Woman, lady of good fortune and practical wisdom. Yet she never visits the caves. You must have other kin too, then, someone who uses these dark places for shelter. I have encountered many animals in my quests, she replied thoughtfully. Who gave you chase, then, and who did not? Raven knew this was a time-honored manner of distinguishing one's animal heritage. Those to whom one was related would be attracted to one, but would not feel threatened. Well, the strangest moment was when I ran into a cougar. She was slumbering, but I mistakenly awoke her. She must have recently eaten, as she regarded me at first with boredom. Then there was a spark in her eyes, as if she recognized something about me. It was an amazing but puzzling thing, Raven. Then she leapt up and pushed herself into me, purring a growly purr. I was so scared that I froze and hoped against hope she would not attack me, but she never did, and even walked with me back out of the caves to my vehicle, and then turned back with a soft chuff, her tail wagging about. It was like a vision in a dream quest, but of course I never returned to those caves. Raven was transfixed by the woman's spirit's accounting. He had an intuition, but the only way to test it further was to wake the woman. She would no longer be able to communicate directly with him, so... I have an idea of who you might have originally been, courageous visionary, but I have to leave you in this form. I ask again, then, after Wolf's whereabouts. Ah, yes, I have seen her. She rusticates a bit higher up the slopes to the northeast of where we are now. There is a series of natural caves up there, not very large. During the day, I reckon you will find her there, was what she said. Good enough. Raven had been slowly refilling the atmosphere of the cavern, and the woman now had awoken. She yelped and gulped, but got up on her feet. Hopefully she would recall as vividly as possible what might well seem to have been a dream to her. Now, peering into her eyes, he recognized her. This was the same spirit that had animated Cayuman's daughter all those generations ago. No wonder her own mother greeted her and kept her safe. That was all she could do, and no wonder the guardian had seemed so happy to see him when she was usually put out at visits that were not visitations, so to speak. Now Raven knew even more soundly that the quest of this woman would eventually succeed. It had all the elements of the highest drama and heroics to it. A noble cause, the cure of the plagues, a noble princess, born outside the circle of the newcomer's know-how and yet pushing her way into it and grasping it for herself. and the gift of generosity of spirit, that what she had grasped would be for the good of all. Raven bid his farewell, and the woman actually waved at him. Finding his way back out again, he turned and wafted upwards to the place where the woman's spirit had directed him. It was not long before he found Wolf. She was asleep, and so Raven waited. It would be best if Wolf started into the city at dusk in any case. Her gray coat would be even more invisible, and of course this was the time when the lost souls began to awake themselves, so Wolf could gather them together. Raven could oversee things, but he knew that the souls of the streets could not follow him as they were. Besides, hopping on one foot would slow things down considerably. The lost souls would never find their way out. On the other hand, he himself would have to return before Wolf, so to explain to the huddle of spirits that they too must help Wolf gather all the people up, as well as what his own further plan would be. Right now they had no idea who was coming for them and how they could be helped. But the encounter with the woman in the cave had given Raven all he needed to that regard. He recalled her now, a frightened couplet, then a carefree girl. But this was some cycles before even the first newcomers had ever appeared. This woman, the spirit of science and the newcomer's skills, could not be the girl he had transformed the little one into. Not the first one, anyway. It was moving for Raven to know now that Cayuman's lost daughter had found herself in such a powerful way. Maybe this too was a metaphor for how the people could regain their lost collective soul. It had partially returned, but all must be able to partake in it. Raven realized now that it was upon this ultimate end that his work was centering itself. His travels were not yet over, but now, for the first time, he could envisage their culmination. Presently, Wolf was waking up, blinking and squinting up at the fading light that insinuated itself through the narrow mouth of the cave. When she saw who was standing before her, she uttered a growl of greeting. "It is surprising but pleasant to see you again, Raven. May I ask what you are doing out here, far from your hemlocks and cedars?" "I have come for you, my old ally of the forest floor. My people are in need of your spirit and all that is contained within it: loyalty, camaraderie, persistence, and determination, generosity and the ability to share, the wiliness of the hunter, but also the compassion of the parent." "Well, that is me, gracious bird, but why, may I ask, do your children have such a need? I just saw one of them not long ago. She had things well in hand, and was after the tiny ones of the darkness, those of another world, to the one you and I know." "I too have met her. Her spirit is Cayuman's daughter, if you can believe it." "Ah, I knew she was a bold one, fearless even. She batted not an eye in my direction when I approached her, questioning her presence. Of course, I didn't enjoy her bright light, but even so. It is not all of my children that I seek your assistance for, only the ones lost in the great city to the west, and other such places. Those who have been far from home for far too long, who no longer even know who they are. You are the one who can guide them back to the path of their own people, and help them regain their own spirits." Wolf looked concerned. Raven knew he had stated his case, but that he would need to cajole his comrade further. "It is a noble cause, Raven, but I do not relish the idea of wandering into such a vast and dangerous place. There is little cover, and little more to eat. And how many of these lost souls are there? I'm betting that no one knows, not even yourself. I have heard from Crow that about 300 corpses are taken out of that place every set of seasons, and most of them are your children, my sorrowful bird." Raven winced at this, though he too had been told by Crow of such a thing. He didn't know whether or not to truly believe it, because his cousin sometimes acted as if he disliked him, but Wolf was not yet finished. "Do you know, my friends and I, all of us, would have to be involved in such a mission. We would have to scour the entire place, and it might take months. But I am willing to at least try. No doubt some of my own family is down there, wolf people. Indeed, I would expect, just as with the Great Plague, that whatever it is that has caused these souls to be lost does not respect clan or pedigree. Even your own kin will be found there, I have no doubt." Once again, Raven had to wince. Wolf was very likely correct, and it was just like her to be immensely practical about it all. Yes, illness, like culture, crossed over everything. It had no respect for kinship, marriage, alliance, or even the hierarchies some of his people had set up over time. That part of it was not exactly sweetness and light, Raven knew. Internecine warfare, slavery, resource allocation hierarchies. But all of his children had been forced to come together due to the conquest and great death. This was the silver lining in the cloud, and indeed the cloud was slowly dispersing. The woman of the caves was a prime example of this. She knew herself, and yet knew the newcomer's works as well. This was the ideal, Raven imagined. But how to get there? "I will fly on ahead of your pack. I am eternally grateful to you, Wolf, for your crucial part in this challenge. As you may have guessed, I am on my own vision quest, seeking the answer to the present day. In you I have found part of it, and in the woman we have both now met, another part. I know not yet what I am missing, but I feel like I've gotten a good hold on the mystery. I am close to understanding it, and after I tell the people of your arrival, I must carry on." "Then do so, wise one. Make sure the people do not fear my approach, or indeed seek to defend themselves against my minions. It will take some time, but you can rely on Wolf and her kin to rescue your lost children." "Remember, they cannot now understand you unless they imagine they are dreaming. They have lost the ability to communicate with their own spirits. What they suffer from is a persistent inability to forget the past, coupled with the absence of community. You will have to use your own patent persistence to explain your goals to them when they are asleep, or yet further, when they are passed out, sadly." To this Wolf simply nodded her understanding and bid Raven farewell. Without looking back then, Raven got himself under way yet again. The lights of the giant city were now spread out before him, a glowing web of the greatest spider ever to spin its tangling discourse. It was home for some, but it was death for others. Raven knew Wolf could sort out who was who to that regard. But now, as he flew over it one last time, before descending to meet once again with the spirits of the lost and broken, he also beheld its pulsing, shimmering beauty, and thus knew that the city could also be a beacon of light in a world unenlightened. Thank you again.